It has been started.
Good morning, everyone. Today is Saturday, January 14th, 2023. It is 10 a.m. East Coast in United States, and it is, I believe, 8:30 p.m. in India. In year 2023, this is our first roundtable discussion on behalf of the Council for Strategic Affairs. I'm going to share my screen with you. I hope you are able to see. That's our logo. The topic for today's discussion is NATO expansion and European wars. And those of you who registered probably saw this flyer when you registered for this particular program. A little bit about Council for Strategic Affairs. Council for Strategic Affairs imparts education in the field of international relations. The Council fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. The Council encourages studies on strategic issues to raise the level of awareness. CSA condemns terrorism in all its forms, anywhere in the world. CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. So as I stated, we have a monthly roundtable discussion on second Saturday of each month at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We do have a monthly guest lecture by a domain expert on fourth Saturday of each month. The Council organizes symposia, meetings, and conferences. Council promotes publications of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. And the Council also has a summer internship program for college students. In today's roundtable discussion, we have three panel experts, and they are very distinguished in their own field, and I'm going to introduce them now. So you see Maj Gen Jagatbir Singh. He is the first panelist. Maj Gen Jagatbir Singh, VSM, is a second generation Armoured Corps officer. He was commissioned into 18th Cavalry in December of 1981 and subsequently commanded the regiment from 2002 to 2005. He also commanded an armored brigade in the deserts where he was responsible for its conversion to Arjun Tanks. He has been an instructor at the IMA and at the Defense Staff College. He served in UN mission in Iraq and Kuwait and served as an AMS in the MS branch. He subsequently commanded the First Armoured Division and retired in 2018 as Director General of Resettlement. He has been writing regularly on defense and security related issues for various newspapers and journals. He is a distinguished fellow with the USI, United Services Institution, India's oldest think tank. And I'm proud to say that he has appeared on our platform before.
The Sports Ministry has decided to host an event to promote yoga and has invited 11
I am having some interference here, so please mute everyone else. Our second panelist is Mr. Aledo. Aledo is a retired US Army officer who was stationed in Europe for almost 5 years. Ran has been a senior defense intelligence agency analyst, CIA analyst, intelligence and operations officer at the US Joint Staff at the Pentagon, DHS Director for Policy for Mexico border and advisor to Afghan police in Kabul in Afghanistan. Ran has given dozens of conferences and master classes about geopolitics and strategic intelligence in France, Romania, Colombia, Italy, Spain, Slovakia, and the United Kingdom. Currently, he resides in Miami, Florida, and owns a consulting company for matters of economics, geopolitics, and intelligence. This is the first time Ron is coming on our platform, but I am also happy to say that I have served as a co-panelist with him on other platforms. And finally, our last distinguished speaker for today is Ambassador Pradeep Kapur. Ambassador Pradeep Kapur is author of Amazon bestseller book, Beyond the COVID-19 Pandemic, Envisioning a Better World by Transforming the Future of Healthcare. He received 2020 IAPC, Indo-American Press Club Excellence in Literature Award, and the 2020 Raymond Aron Group Health for All Award for his latest book. He is an acknowledged luminary diplomat with a distinguished career, working very closely with heads of governments, heads of states, and other global leaders and policymakers in different continents of the world, Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, and South America. As an educator, he has taught some of the most prestigious universities, including Sorbonne University in Paris, IIT Roorkee, MDI in Gurugram, Georgetown University, University of Maryland College Park, and as a visiting scholar at George Washington University. He has served as honorary professor at many of the universities. He is a proud alumnus of IIT Delhi with BTech in Electrical Engineering, MTech in Systems and Management Studies. He is currently working as an international strategic advisor to Intellectual Design Arena Inc., Executive Director of Smart Village Development Fund at the Wheels Global Foundation, an initiative of IIT alumni in United States and in India, supporting rural development in water, healthcare, education, etc., etc. He is also Director of Ambassador Circles. He is affiliated with American Hindu Coalition and is chairperson of Advisory Council diplomacyindia.com. He has been invited regularly as a commentator on national TV channels for geopolitical analysis, is author of many articles, books, speaks besides English, French, Spanish, and various other Indian languages. And I am proud to say that Ambassador Kapur has served on this platform a number of times. Usually I give a brief introduction of the topic, but I must say with these three panelists, we have more than 100 years of very distinguished professional experience in international relations, in geopolitics, and strategic issues. So we have a very, very powerful panel today. Our topic is NATO expansion. So this is the logo of the NATO, which was founded on 4th April 1949. When it was founded, it had 10 European countries and 2 North American countries. I'm not going to name them, but at this time, NATO has 30 countries as its members. There are 2 countries that are approved to be admitted already, and that is Sweden and Finland. And Ukraine, Zelensky claims that his country is now almost a member of NATO now. Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia are also in the line to join. It's important to understand when you become a member of NATO, the Article 5 of NATO confers protection to all the NATO members. And this map shows you how NATO looked like in 1998 and now how NATO looks in 2022. This is from 2022. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our distinguished panelists to discuss this particular issue. A few housekeeping rules. I would like everyone to keep themselves on mute to avoid noise interference. We already had one episode of noise interference. Please change your cell phones to vibration mode. Please do not interrupt our esteemed panelists. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to ask questions. No anonymous questions, please. All the questions are moderated. Questions have to be sent through chat function. You are not allowed to ask questions directly. Please be very specific and precise in asking a question. Don't write a lecture in the chat function as a form of a question. And lastly, like all our programs, this program is being recorded. It would be available on our YouTube channel. It would be available on other platforms like Rumble and Odyssey within 24 hours. So those people who are not able to watch it live today will be able to watch it later on within 24 hours. So let's start with our expert panelists. Our first panelist is Major General Jagatbir Singh. And sir, the floor is yours. Please go ahead. Major General Jagatbir Singh. Kindly unmute yourself, sir. Unmute yourself.
Good morning, sir, and good evening to those listeners in India, and Jai Hind to everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Adityanjee for his very kind words of introduction and also for inviting me to be part of this roundtable discussion with such an eminent and distinguished panelists such as Mr. Ron Aledo and Ambassador Pradeep Kapur. It is indeed an honor and privilege for me to have been given this invite. And before I proceed any further, I wish you all a very, very happy 2023. Please excuse me. Lenin had once remarked that there are decades when nothing happens and then weeks when decades happen. He was, of course, referring to the time when the changeover from the Tsarist regime took over, and that was around 1917. But today we are in the midst of what a lot of analysts call a dangerous decade, or an historical hinge with the Ukrainian conflict, which is no doubt being referred to as one of the biggest strategic shocks impacting the world. In fact, for a large period of time, the world and a lot of people have thought that globalization and integration would act as a protective shield. But today we are again seeing that violence remains the dominant language. And one of the causative reasons for this conflict, the other one being, President Vladimir Putin's personality, is being attributed to the expansion of NATO. And that is more specifically the eastward expansion of NATO. So today's focus is on that. And before I, start giving my points, there's a joke which is doing the rounds on the internet, in which a Russian wife once recently asked her husband and said, "What is the President Putin's special military operation? What has our glorious leader achieving?" And the husband replied and said, "It is a war to stop NATO." And then she asked him, "How is it going?" And he listed out, what all has happened, the reverses suffered by both sides, the damage suffered in Ukraine, the deaths in Russia, the removal of their chiefs, and that's how it's going. And she said, "What about NATO? What are the losses on their side?" And he turned around and said, "Well, NATO haven't turned up yet." So I think that about sums up one part of this conflict and the eastward expansion. Vladimir Putin had talked about that in 2021. He said the true sovereignty of Ukraine is only possible in partnership with Russia. It's an inalienable part of Russian history, culture, and its spiritual space. But where are we today? Has Ukraine wanting to join NATO brought the alliance right up to the borders of Russia? And will this presence of NATO on the borders of Russia enable its missiles to strike Moscow in minutes? Putin himself put it when he said, "We have no place further we can go now. It is not a situation we can accept." NATO had expanded 1,000 kilometers eastward, or as you had said, 1,100 kilometers eastward since the USSR imploded. And that is when everyone knows what Secretary of State James Baker had once told then Soviet president, later the Russian President Gorbachev in Moscow in 1990, that there would be no extension of NATO jurisdiction, not 1 inch to the east. When USSR broke up and Russia took over the mantle, at that stage, Boris Yeltsin had once proposed that NATO be dissolved since the threat was no more. He even suggested a European peace force which would include Russia. Yet, NATO marched eastwards, inching closer to Russia. Dr. Henry Kissinger himself warned that the expansion of NATO would be a red line for Russia, a direct threat to its security, which would force it to respond. His warnings and that of many other strategic thinkers, including George Kennan, have they been ignored? Has this red line been crossed? But has NATO joined the conflict? There are many questions that need to be answered. Russia per se has always felt vulnerable from the east. This is the area from where the Germans advanced in World War II. This is the area from where Napoleon swept into Moscow earlier. This is the area from where they have felt most vulnerable. I will not go into, the history of NATO because I think you've gone into that in detail. You've talked about how it's expanded and it's now 30 countries, and there are two more countries, Finland and Sweden, which are on the northern borders of Russia. Mainly Finland shares a border with Russia, and once Finland joins Russia, that is going to be the longest border of any NATO country with Russia. Now, NATO has applied for membership, but has its membership been accepted? It has lately even asked for accelerated membership as early as November, but nothing has been given so far. Whereas Russia felt that NATO should not allow Ukraine to become a member, whereas NATO rightly felt that Russia is no one to dictate who should become a NATO member or who should not. So you have these two sides of the coin. Now, you are well aware of what has gone on in Ukraine over the past few years. I'll not dwell into that, but there have been instances where Russia has felt threatened. In July 21, Ukraine and America co-hosted a major naval exercise in the Black Sea region, which involved navies from over 32 countries. And Operation Sea Breeze almost provoked Russia to fire at a British naval destroyer. I mean, this is as close as you had got to conflict at that time. One of the principal threats Russia feels is also in the Black Sea region. The Black Sea, as you know, is the only port of Russia which is available to it all through the year, whereas its other two ports, the Baltic and the area to the east of Russia, during winters are frozen. And of course, now you have Finland almost and Sweden joining NATO, so they may prevent the Russian Baltic, they may choke the Russian Baltic fleet in the north, whereas they feel that if a NATO fleet is stationed in the Black Sea, that itself will impinge on their sovereignty to a degree. And you saw what happened in 2014 when they took over Crimea. Now, most people, a lot of analysts have said that NATO may not be the root cause of the conflict, but it did little to halt it. So, is NATO directly involved? Has it intervened directly, or has it only supported President Zelensky, given him certain amount of reassurances, but have they halted short of certain key reassurances? This is something I'm sure our esteemed panelists will be discussing and will know about. For example, you've had certain situations which have occurred. As far as NATO is concerned, the post the breakup of the Soviet Union, you saw that there was certain amount, I can't say complacency, but I can say there was scaling down of their security structures. So has the US taken over the security of the NATO, and are NATO countries now being forced to spend more on their security in view of this perceived threat from Russia? The build-up has also taken place by battalion-size battle groups, as long as certain other forces in the alliances, that is the NATO's eastern flank, that covers Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And there has been an increase of troops in this area from 40,000 to almost 3 lakhs. So now US has approximately 100,000 forces in the European theater. The USA and NATO countries initially provided Ukraine with certain amount of material support, and after all, it's gone on to certain sophisticated support in terms of precision-guided weapons, and most precisely the javelins and HIMARS, which have played a major role in, stemming the Russian advance, as well as in the promoting the counter-offensives as far as the Ukrainian forces is concerned. There is no doubt that the US and the NATO's have been providing satellite information, advance warning of Russian action, and use of their communication networks to track, identify, the Russian movements. Now, does NATO need to intervene directly? Will NATO intervene directly? And can NATO intervene directly? Officially, most people say, and this is also said by the defense minister of Ukraine as past 3 days ago, that Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO, but it may be a de facto member of NATO, but it is not as on date a de jure member of NATO. Hence, Article 5, what you talked about, what Dr. Adityanjee talked about, is still not applicable as far as NATO is concerned. NATO would ideally prefer to continue the battle and provide arms and aid to Ukraine to weaken Russia on its behalf. And as the war progresses, this war can go anyway, though I feel that the winter is a time when we should press for peace. The other issue is that NATO must also remember that in the long term, the threat to the world peace does not come from Russia, but lies elsewhere, and that is in China. Now, there are two other issues I'd like to touch very briefly upon before I end my piece. And one is a thing which I'm, having been an Armored Corps officer, like you said, is the use of equipment. Now, just to show how complicated it is, there's a lot in the press these days regarding provision of tanks to Ukraine. Now, it is not that easy. The Americans are not able to provide their Abraham tanks for reasons of operational issues. As far as Germany is concerned, they are not giving the Leopard 2 tanks. They are not even allowing the countries who have got the Leopard 2 tanks to give it to Ukraine to fight the war. Though, of course, they're saying this may change. The only person who's stepping forward to give the certain amount of tanks now is UK, and they are providing the Challenger 2 tanks. So this is as far as I've got to say regarding the equipment that goes there. We also have seen a large amount of times when President Putin has threatened Ukraine with the use of nuclear weapons. Now, the moot point remains is that he has turned nuclear deterrence on its head and used threatening of nuclear weapons to continue with the conflict. And and further his agenda as far as this conflict is concerned. The question remains is whether NATO will be able or would like to defend or provide a guarantee of a NATO of a nuclear umbrella to Ukraine. There are various issues that remain as far as this is concerned, but as I say that as George Kennan had said, the expansion of NATO into Central Europe was one of the most fateful errors of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. President Putin had at that time said very clearly in 2000 that Russia is part of European culture, and I cannot imagine my own country in isolation from Europe and what I call the civilized world, so it's hard to visualize NATO as my enemy. Today, in 2023, these words hold no meaning. Thank you very much, sir. Any questions? I'll take them on later.
Thank you, Major General Jagatbir Singh, for a very, very educational, very informative, presentation. We'll take the questions in the end. Now it's my honor to invite our second distinguished panelist, Mr. Ran Aledo. Ran, the floor is yours. You have around 15 minutes to speak. Please unmute yourself, Ran. You are muted.
Sir, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor. I'm very happy and honored to be here with you this morning. It's a great opportunity, and I really appreciate for the invitation. That's first to all my friends here in the United States and in India. I'm gonna share my screen. You allow me for a second, so I can. Can you see my screen, gentlemen? Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. We can.
Okay, awesome. Second. So I'm going to talk about my perspective of what I understand is the cause, the main cause, the root cause, as we call it in intelligence. We call it the root cause, the Toyota 5 whys, the why of this current war between Russia and Ukraine, and actually Russia and NATO, because NATO is the one that is fully supporting, and the United States, obviously, on top of it, is the one who is fully supporting and fully behind the Ukrainian military right now. So you already gave me a great introduction. I really appreciate for that. This is my contact, but later on I will share it with you for all those that are interested, my YouTube channel. As you said, I was in Afghanistan 4 times, and I was an advisor to the police over there in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and in the north, in Bagram, etc. A great experience of me, and I have the chance to participate for many years in the intelligence community in the United States, with the CIA, DIA, the Pentagon, etc. So I'm going to talk about why it's so important for Russia to prevent Ukraine to be member of NATO. Those of you who like history, you will recall the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, in the fall of 1942, and that ended in early 1943. Today, that city of Stalingrad is Volgograd. The Germans knew that that area over there of the Soviet Union then, of Russia today, is the industrial heart, the oil heart, the industrial heart of Russia. That's where the oil is, that's where the heavy industry is, that's where the food basket also is. That's an important, extremely important area of Russia. And that's why the German army tried in desperation to take that area. They knew that if they take that area, they most likely will knock out the Soviet Union at that time in 1942. They will win the war just by taking the richness, the oil, the industry on that area. And that area today haven't changed. It's still a rich area of heavy industry, oil, and the food basket of Russia. Russia cannot allow a NATO army within reach of Volgograd, of the Caucasus, of the North Caucasus. They need a buffer, and that buffer is what we call Ukraine. Ukraine, as you know, is a kind of a mixed country with a very different people on it. The south and the east are Russian-speaking Ukrainians, are of the Russian Orthodox Church that speak Russian as a first language. They have a lot of family in Russia. The north and the west part of Ukraine is basically parts of Poland and Hungary that were taken out from Hungary and from Poland and given to this new country that we now call Ukraine. But basically, that people on the north and the west have no relationship at all with Russia, and that people have no links at all with the Russian heritage at all. And the center of the country, basically, that is what we can call properly Ukraine, the old parts of Kiev. That is basically the same people of Russia, but with some differences, with some different language variation that they call Ukrainian. But that is basically the thing that Russia can never allow to have in their borders. A NATO country with a NATO army, with missiles looking at Moscow in a few minutes, with an army ready to take Volgograd, to do exactly what the Germans tried to do back in 1942, taking Stalingrad. The root cause of all this issue goes to 1996, believe it or not. 1996, the Soviet Union is no more, the Warsaw Pact is no more, and there was a big discussion at the White House at the time. What are we going to do? Should we push to expand NATO or not? And a lot of people at the Bill Clinton White House told him not to expand NATO, that will be the foolish thing to do, a very fool and irrational thing to do that will challenge Russia, that will raise the rage and the fury of Russia, that will provoke Russia. But there were other people at the White House in the Bill Clinton in 1996 that told him, no, we need to expand to the east. We need to take over those countries of the former Warsaw Pact. We need to talk the Eastern European countries. Why? Because if not, then we will have no influence over those countries. We will have no way to influence them, to actually to manage them, actually ways to tell them what to do. The Europeans, the French will do that, the Germans will do that, the British will do that, but we will not be able to do that. But we are in NATO, so if we expand NATO, then we automatically, some way, somehow, we will become kind of the bosses of those little poor countries of the East. Those countries are poor. Those countries, they need guidance. And if they join NATO, then we will have a heavy influence over them. They will be begging us for economic help. They will be begging us for military aid. They will be begging us for us to station U.S. soldiers in their countries, and in that way we will manipulate them. So Clinton was not sure what to do. But then came the 1996 elections, and he was kind of worried about the elections of 1996. And he realized, people on his staff told him, listen, if we expand NATO to the east, there are a lot of Polish people here in the United States, a lot of Hungarian people in the United States, Lithuanians, people in the United States. They will be happy with you, and they will vote for you in the elections of 1996. So that decided Clinton's mind. Okay, I need to do everything I can to win these elections in 1996. And he decided to push for the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, regardless of the very wise advice to the contrary that he received. So basically, it was a domestic U.S. policy that Clinton did to win the elections of 1996, something that was not really that extraordinary nor important in universal history. But because of that 1996 election, Clinton did change universal history, because all presidents after Clinton, all presidents perhaps with the exception of Trump, all presidents, Obama and Bush, all presidents follow Clinton, and all presidents push for ever expansion to the east. And obviously, the big crowd, the big prize, the big first prize, the golden prize that they want to take was Ukraine. Ukraine was the #1 country that the United States wanted to control. And when I say the United States, I say NATO, but when I say NATO, I say the United States. The United States wants to control Ukraine from the very beginning. They want to have the say, the ultimate say of who governs Ukraine and how that people governs Ukraine. And everything began in 1996 with the elections of the general presidential elections. I can give you extraordinary great advice. I can be a very wise man and give you a great advice. But if you don't listen because you are a fanatic in your that are closed in your mind, in your ears, you are a fanatic in your thinking, in your ideology, doesn't matter how great advice I can give you. You are not going to listen to me. So people have been warning, just like the general said, for years and for decades that this was a fool idea. It was the idea of the fool, a foolish idea to expand NATO to the east, that we will end up with war. People say it, just like Henry Kissinger said in 2014. To Russia, Ukraine can never be just another country. Ukraine, especially the south of Ukraine and the east of Ukraine, is historic part of Russia, is what part of all the Russias, is part of that entity of the Russian nation, and Russia can never allow that to go away. It's essential part of their culture, of their heritage, of the links of their country. Ukraine should not join NATO, say Kissinger. John Mearsheimer, one of the great geopolitics experts in the United States, a professor of geopolitics and perhaps the greatest expert in the United States or Russia, said the West is leading Ukraine into the big problems. The end result is going to be war, and Ukraine is going to get wrecked. He said that in 2015. We are encouraging that big problem, and his prophecy became reality in 2022. Jack Matlock, ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1987 to 1991, he gave a warning in 1997 that NATO expansion was the most profound strategic blunder that could produce the most serious security threats in the Soviet Union's collapse. And his prediction was also true. That created the war that we're seeing now, and now we are fighting and we are playing with nuclear war. We are playing with Armageddon. We are playing with the Judgment Day. Other people gave great warnings. Strop Talbot, a former Secretary of State. Many Russians see NATO as a vestige of the Cold War. This will obviously provoke the Russians. Robert Gates, the former Secretary of State of the United States, trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was truly overreaching. It was reckless, ignoring that the Russians consider that their own national interest. We need to understand that this war that began in 2022 really did not begin in 2022. It began in 2014. Russia signed peace with Ukraine in December of 2013. The president of Russia and the president of Ukraine, they signed a $15 billion bailout agreement, peace and love forever between Russia and Ukraine in December of 2013. There was peace. There was not intention to invade Crimea or to bomb Kiev or to have a war or anything like that. Well, it was peace, peace, and peace between Ukraine and Russia in December of 2013. But 2 months later, after Ukraine and Russia signed the peace agreement, then the Obama came into play. Obama and Victoria Nuland, her woman to destabilize Ukraine. Victoria Nuland confessed she spent $5 billion, $5,000 million in propaganda in Ukraine just to move the public opinion of the Ukrainians against Russia and in favor of the United States and in favor of NATO. And then in February of 2014, just 2 months after Russia signed peace with Ukraine, came the famous coup d'etat, the famous coup of Euromaidan, for 80 policemen dead, and the United States installed a puppet government, completely anti-Russian, completely pro the United States, completely pro NATO in Kiev. So the peace that Russia signed with Ukraine in December of 2013 only lasted like 2 months, thanks to Victoria Nuland, thanks to Obama, thanks to Biden, who was the vice president of the United States by that time. What I tell people is, listen to the real experts. Don't listen to the main media. No, obviously here in the United States, listen to Professor Meyershammer, listen to Tucker Carlson, listen to Henry Kissinger, to Pat Buchanan, especially listen to U.S. Army Colonel Douglas McGregor and Colonel Richard Black. Those are not neocons. They will not follow the media narrative. They will tell you the truth here in the United States about what is going on in Ukraine. That's what I tell everybody all the time. Listen to the real expert. Do not listen to the media. Do not listen to CNN. They will just follow the Biden line and the Ukrainian government line. And India has taken the very smart route, India, of having neutrality. They are not following blindly the United States. They are not following blindly NATO. They are taking their own stance. India has 20%, more or less 20% of the world population. The foreign minister of India has been very clear. We are not going to follow the United States. We're going to take our own position, and we're going to defend our own India interests. Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it.
I thank you very much, Ron, for bringing parts of history that are lost in the mist and lost in the national jingoistic moments. When a wave of jingoism takes over, people forget history. And those people who forget history are always condemned to repeat it. So I'm very glad that you brought the historical dimension to fore with your military and intelligence experience and informed our viewers that a lot more was going on prior to February 24th, 2022. Now it's my distinct honor to invite Ambassador Pradeep Kapur, who is a, very distinguished expert in international relations, a practitioner, educator, and a media personality. So Professor Kapur, it's yours now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adityanjee, and thank you to CSA for organizing this talk on a very important topic at this point of time. And thank you to the other panelists who have spoken before me on putting forth a very, very interesting narrative. I will start with my own personal experiences. I was in Georgetown University as a faculty in the School of Foreign Service in 1991-92. The USSR had just fallen, and I had been following that very closely as a diplomat for India in many countries, because I used to be quite surprised at the size of the US embassies in so many countries. And the size of the US diplomacy itself is many times larger than that of the Indian diplomacy or other countries. When I did a closer study, I realized that while the Indian Foreign Service consists of about 700 diplomats, in the United States State Department, there are 14,000 diplomats compared to about 700 Indian diplomats, with 9,000 being posted all over the world and 5,000 working out of Washington, D.C. headquarters. And then there are another 22,000 accredited diplomats from the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, Department of Homeland Security, etc. And during the era while the USSR still existed as a political entity in the world, almost all the US embassies had a specific wing within their structure dedicated to studying in depth all the actions which were happening between that country where they were posted and the USSR, and reporting to headquarters all the time. And this team included members from the intelligence, from CIA, and from other departments, just monitoring this aspect of USSR and that country's relationship. And the entire effort was to make sure that the paradigm was that to show the failure and collapse of USSR would also impact very significantly communism and give a boost to democracy. So when this happened finally in 91, the attitude at that time from 89 onwards actually was that we will decide about the future shape of Russia in terms of its economic structures, in terms of its political structures. So for me, that seemed like a little far-fetched, to be able to make those statements that since we have been able to destroy USSR as it existed and break it into so many different republics, now we will go further. So during my visits to many of these countries which were formerly part of the USSR or even affiliated to the USSR, the leadership in those countries would point out delegations from the Western world all the time and saying that there is a lot of disruption going on currently. And we have too many delegations coming in from Europe, from Western Europe, and from North America, US, and Canada. And they are trying to wean us away from our links with Russia. And a lot of people were not very comfortable with that. Now, if we look at Ukraine, Ukraine is the largest country of Europe after Russia. And it shares a very big border with Russia. And as one of the earlier panelists said, that to dismember Russia in the future, if Ukraine is a member of NATO, you are within striking distance of Moscow and within striking distance of Volgograd and most of Russia. So if we look at the mirror image, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when USSR tried to position missiles in Cuba, USA objected very fiercely to that and said that it's a red line which they will not allow to be crossed. There was a standoff for many days and almost about 45 days till finally both USSR and USA agreed that USSR would not position those missiles in Cuba, and a very serious situation was averted. Now Russia has been clamoring from 1945 and 1949 when NATO came into existence that there should be no eastern expansion. What we are used to hearing all the time is the Western narrative. So we do not get to hear the other side of the story very clearly or very categorically. And every time they have been told that, okay, we will not do the expansion. And then the Russian side, the Russian version is that when they again start the expansion into another country eastwards, at that stage when Russia tells them that you had promised that you would not do that, they say we did not enter into a written agreement with you. So that story has been repeated a lot of times. We have seen all the great thought leaders of the world who have been advising the Western countries, including USA and NATO and Western Europe, that this is a red line which should not be crossed. Even geostrategically, from the perspective of Russia, it's a very dangerous situation to have NATO right on its borders. But to that extent, Finland is another red herring for Russia currently, almost on the verge of becoming a NATO member. If I look at the other perspective also, so Cuba and the USA missile crisis is another aspect. But what did Austria do in 1955? Faced with a similar situation, it declared its neutrality and said that it would never become a member of NATO. So Austria still survives as a prosperous country in Europe, between the two Europes, West and East. So for me, if I look at the current situation in Ukraine today and the Ukraine-Russia war, to me it seems like it's a tale of two Vladimirs who have their own goals, their own aspirations, their own objectives. And I am surprised in the sense that, when I think into the future as to how will history judge the two Vladimirs, it will, of course, depend on the outcome of the Ukraine-Russia war. But as Winston Churchill told Anthony Eden at the time of, the Nuremberg trials, when the German generals were being tried after the Second World War, and he asked Anthony Eden that what is the lesson of the story? What is the moral that you draw from all these trials? These great German generals who were so successful on so many battlefronts, who led the German army very victoriously, were being treated as the worst war criminals and tried in very, very humiliating conditions. So Anthony Eden could not respond to that. He said that I do not know. And Winston Churchill responded that the lesson is that never lose a war. Because once you lose a war, you are a war criminal, everything you have done is wrong, etc. So never be on the losing side. That was his advice, that the lesson is that never be on the losing side. So who will ultimately turn out to be on the losing side has to be seen. But in terms of just the ground realities of the world of Ukraine today, seeing the destruction today, I am quite surprised that there is not yet a revolt by the Ukrainian people against Vladimir Zelensky, because to see your houses being destroyed in front of your eyes, to see your economy being destroyed in front of your eyes, to see your livelihoods being destroyed in front of your eyes, to see your family members dying, to see so much of sort of destruction and absolute devastation, I would still bet that that day is not very far off when there will be a revolt against Vladimir Zelensky and people will demand peace. And the price that they would have had to pay was non-membership of NATO. And if Ukraine has had such close links with Russia for hundreds of years, and some of the presidents of USSR and Russia for the longest duration, I was reading somewhere, have been Ukrainian origin people. So if those are the sort of links which have been there in the past, I, as a scholar of geostrategy, geopolitics, geoeconomics, fail to fathom as to how he could have been led up the garden path by the Western world, as the two earlier panelists and particularly the second one has also mentioned. And if there has been so much advice by so many distinguished scholars, and including Professor John Mersheimer, Robert Gates, even Henry Kissinger, whom I'm not fond of at all, but even he has advised so strongly against this being a red line. And what has it resulted in? If I see it in the context, if I have to think back, reflect, and pause and see how it is impacting the world, the Western world, the global world, these two countries were providing a lot of the grains and the crops to the entire world. Energy resources, phenomenal energy sources, the impact on and minerals and so many other supply chains which were going through these two countries, which had kept the global economy on an even keel. Now that has been disrupted completely. But what is a even bigger impact is that the action by the United States of throwing Russia out of SWIFT, out of the dollar trading system, has given Russia a free hand now to trade in rubles and to trade in other currencies of the world, like the yuan, like the rupee, and like so many other currencies with which they are insisting on trading for their oil and gas and natural resources and other exports from Russia. Now, when Saddam Hussein tried to de-dollarize petrol, we know what happened to him and to his country. When Gaddafi tried to de-dollarize again his economy, we have seen the results. So for the first time, it is US now which has taken the steps and legitimized this action of de-dollarization. So dollar, the history of the dollar, if we look at, till 1971, the currencies were pegged against the gold standard. In 1971, the then US President Nixon decided to, remove this peg against the gold standard. After that, what happened was America could print as many dollars as it wanted, raise as much debt as it wanted. To explain it in very, very simplified terms, if you are playing a game of Monopoly, every player on the board gets a certain amount of currency to play and win those cities and create, villages and towns and whatever. Here, you are the banker also, you are lending the money also, you are printing the money also, and you are a player also. So that was the position of the US till before they decided to throw Russia out of the international dollar system, dollar trading system. So suddenly now there is a big question mark on why we should continue to trade in dollars. Now, if that gains momentum, the capacity of US to print dollars endlessly and bankroll itself and bankroll any other countries which it wanted to bankroll earlier, like Pakistan or whatever, those days will soon become history. What leads as a corollary of that? Once the dollar loses its value and crashes, the Western currencies are already halfway there. The inflation which has impacted the Western world is very, very high. And that is only the beginning. Suddenly, you will find that the capacity for the Western world to buy goods from anywhere in the world will also crash. Minerals value, minerals like gold and other minerals, the value will go up very, very significantly. The countries of Asia, which have a very strong domestic economic sector and which have great capacities in the service economy, in the manufacturing economy, and which are very highly self-reliant, will continue to thrive and survive and prosper. Countries like China, which are already graying, which are very serious geopolitical and geostrategic problems with each of their neighbors, and economic problems internally, and problems with Hong Kong and Taiwan and everywhere. I wonder when that country will face an imminent collapse, basically, because I have not seen any country in the history of the world which has sort of created so many fronts, opened up so many flanks, and created so many enemies, being able to thrive or survive or prosper. So, in my opinion, all the talk about China becoming global economy number one, becoming a hegemon, etc., most powerful military in the world, all that is history. And there are other countries which will probably, get together, also go down the path of de-dollarization, and thereby starting the decline of the Western world and the Western narrative of the history and events of the world. So I'm going to stop here and I'm open to questions. Very happy to answer those. Thank you very much again, Dr. Adityanjee. Namaste.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Pradeep Kapur, for your very wise comments from international relations perspective. Because unless you keep that perspective in mind, relying just on military maneuvers does not give you victory. And yes, people in today's era should understand the statesmanship of President John F. Kennedy and the then Soviet leader in diffusing an international crisis which could have led to Third World War and a nuclear exchange, which would have been detrimental for the whole world. And I think those are the kinds of lessons from history we are forgetting in today's conflicts. We have a number of questions, and I will go over those questions from the chat function, item by item. But before I do that, I will use my moderator's prerogative to highlight on a couple of things that really has not been covered so far. I'm myself a history buff, and actually the topic for today's presentation was NATO expansion and European wars. Actually, the topic did not stay specifically Ukraine-Russia conflict. So I'll show you some visuals. And if you see this visual is from 1995. The famous Dayton Accord. What did Dayton Accord achieve? Dayton Accord led to a Western-sponsored breakup of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. At that time, the lead was taken by European Union for Slovenia and Croatia to secede from Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So you had, after 1995 Dayton Accord, a rump state of remnants of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and that were Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia, Montenegro. And province by province, these provinces were removed from the remnant state of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So here you have another state, Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was allowed to secede from the remnant of Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And actually, United States and NATO went on war to do that. And you have a famous Madeline's War in 1998, in that Serbia and Belgrade were bombed for almost 3 months to soften them up, to allow independence to an artificial contrived country. It's a tiny countrylet of Kosovo. The justification given was self-determination, democracy, and human rights. But ironically, the first prime minister of Kosovo was later declared actually a terrorist by United States. So these are part of the legacy of NATO expansion in Eastern Europe and various wars that have predated the current war in the Europe. And I know that Ron had talked about Victoria Nuland trying to engineer the Euromaidan so-called revolution and spend $5 billion. And at that time, the US ambassador to Ukraine was current Assistant Secretary General Jeffrey Piot. And in a telephone conversation that was recorded between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Piot, Jeffrey Piot is saying that European Union will have some reservations about this plan, And Victoria Nuland was on record saying, I'm sorry to say those words. So all those things are on record in history. So the war did not start in February 24th, 2022. This is a slow walking war of NATO, going on from mid 1990s. Unfortunately, in 1990s, the Russian Federation had a president that was very well supported by United States. That president was Boris Yeltsin, who in the name of democracy was allowed to actually destroy the Russian Federation's parliament with tanks. So much about talk about expanding democracy. So we need to really give careful attention to the history of 1990s before we comment on today's war, because they are continuum of one and the same thing. The last comment before taking up these questions that I will make is Ukraine as a country was created in 1917, actually. Kiev Rus was the origin of Orthodox Russian Slavic civilization historically. The origin of current Russian Federation is actually Kiev Rus. While both Russian Federation and Ukraine were part of the former Soviet Union, I think it was Stalin who transferred the province of Crimea from Russian Federation to Ukraine in 1954. Because both the states were part of the same larger Soviet empire, there was no noise about it. But Ukraine did not own Crimea. Crimea was part of Russian Federation, which Stalin by his decree did in 1954. So historical claim of Ukraine on Crimea was also very, very doubtful. I'm bringing these actually historical facts to the table for people to understand, and rather than be carried away by a certain kind of propaganda or one-sided information warfare. And now I will start reading the questions, and I brought these facts because some of the chat function questions are referring to some of the related issues. So the first question is from Dr. Minual. As an independent and sovereign country, Ukraine is free to decide whether to join NATO or not. How can Russia invade Ukraine in case the latter is interested to join NATO? In the context of Russian invasion on a sovereign country, can we say that international law is meaningless? I'll start with Ron Aledo. Ron?
Well, Ukraine as an independent country did not want to join NATO. Ukraine as an independent country wanted to sign peace with Russia, and they did in December of 2013. That was the true, legitimate, full government of Ukraine that included Crimea, included the Donbass, included all the eastern areas of Ukraine. So the legitimate president Yanukovych of the Party of the Regions, the president of Ukraine, did not want to join NATO. That was their independent sovereign country decision. Their independent sovereign country decision was to sign a peace deal for $15 billion with Russia to get cheap gas, to sign peace with Russia, and to join our economic agreement with Russia. That was the independent sovereign nation decision of Ukraine. The United States did not like that. Obama did not like that. And that's why they organized a coup in February of 2014. So they removed the legitimate democratically elected president of Ukraine and they put a puppet. That's a Victoria Nuland put a puppet that will do whatever the United States tell them to do. If the United States tell them jump, they will jump. If the United States says run, they will run. If the United States says touch your head, they will touch their head. They do whatever the United States tell them to do. And that puppet government obviously is put over there by Victoria Nuland, Barack Obama, first Poroshenko, now Zelensky. They do whatever the United States tell them to do, and they tell the United States, gave them the order, hey, now try to join NATO. But that is not the real government of Ukraine. That president was not elected by the voters of Crimea. They did not vote in that election. The voters of Donbass did not vote in that election. The real president of Ukraine, the legitimate president of Ukraine, elected by all Ukrainians, including those of Donbass, those of Donetsk, those of Lysychansk, those of Crimea, Yanukovych, the democratically elected president of Ukraine, he took a sovereign, independent decision of signing peace with Russia. And that's something that Obama did not respect, did not want it. Victoria Nuland did not respect, and they organized an illegal, undemocratic coup in February just so they can put somebody that will do whatever the United States tells them to do.
Thank you, Ran. I will invite actually Major General Jagatbir Singh to give his comments before I go to Ambassador Kapur. You're muted, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. Just one point. You mentioned that it was Stalin in 54 who handed over Crimea to Ukraine. In fact, it was Khrushchev in 54 who handed over Crimea to Ukraine. And why I'm saying this is that Khrushchev was a Ukrainian. Brezhnev was a Ukrainian. Gorbachev's mother was a Ukrainian. So what I'm trying to get at is that a history, the geostrategy of a country is bound by its history, by its culture, by its language, and by its borders. Now, these four are more deeply intertwined with Russia, like you very correctly brought out. It owes its origin to Rus Kiev and the Orthodox Church, rather than to NATO, and has been wonderfully brought out by my panelist Ron. He covered exactly the role of US having to play in this. And I would just like to throw a counter to this. You very correctly talked about the red lines which existed when a communist country at that time, Cuba, the Soviet Union supported it. And there was a deal that time that took place, which was not publicized then, but has come out now in the papers, which a lot of people are talking about, is that when actually President Kennedy agreed to remove missiles from Turkey as well as Greece in response to Soviet Union removing the missiles from Cuba. Now, how would the US like it if the Russia had gone and had security guarantees with Mexico or Canada, their two borders, so countries bordering them. So these are things that we have to think about, that we have to talk about. It's very right to say that, every country is a sovereign and can choose its own, take its decisions in the way it wants. But there are certain underlying factors which are not that clearly spelt out, which play a major role in influencing its decision and have a bearing on the manner in which it takes its decisions. That's all I'd like to say, sir.
Thank you, Major General. I stand corrected about, Stalin versus Khrushchev, and actually you are very right on the point about the Ukrainian origins of both Khrushchev and Brezhnev. I'm going to invite Ambassador Kapur on the same question. That Ukraine was a sovereign country, it had every right to join NATO. What is the counterpoint?
Well, I would defer to the comments made by my very distinguished co-panelists, Ron Aledo and General Jagatbir Singh. And I think we should move on to other questions so that we have time to deal with those also. This has been adequately answered by both of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kapur. The next question is from Narayan Kumar, and it is, what was the immediate provocation for Russia to invade Ukraine? Putin had already denied Ukrainian statehood and sovereignty in a speech many years before the overt invasion of Ukraine. Isn't the NATO expansion a subterfuge to invade Ukraine. And I'll go back again to Ron first because of his specialist experience. So Ron, please go ahead and answer this question.
Well, there were many. Again, we have to use the intelligence method. There is many root causes. Obviously, the first root cause was the February the 2014 Victoria Nuland coup that destroy and to remove the legitimate democratically elected president Yanukovych of Ukraine and install a puppet government in Ukraine. That was the first one. Then the rearmament of Ukraine. Russia will never allow, cannot allow a strong arm and Western-oriented Ukraine for the reasons I explained at the beginning, because the border, that border with Volgograd, with the Caucasus is sacred. They need to protect, they need a buffer, not a military force over there. Then there was the Minsk Agreement, 1 and 2, that Ukraine refused to follow. Those Minsk Agreement gave them fully, I mean, not independent, but fully autonomy to the Donbas regions of Donetsk and Luhansk and Lugansk. And they were to be respected by the Ukrainian government. And they also gave them veto power to the Donbas areas, to those in semi-independent areas, to veto international relations decisions. And the Ukrainian government, obviously under the influence of the United States, refused to execute the Minsk Agreement. So that was another immediate trigger. But the last trigger, the ones that, let's say, the glass of water that Russia could not handle anymore, was the November 2021 agreement that the United States signed with the government of Ukraine. It is still in the State Department website. It's a military and economic agreement, mutual defense agreement, an economic agreement and geopolitical agreement between the United States and Ukraine signed on November of 2021. You can go to the State Department and you can read. And he said that the United States will help Ukraine to recover Crimea, that the United States will give weapons to Ukraine, that the United States will do labs, biological labs in Ukraine, that the United States will help in any way or form to make stronger the Ukrainian military, that the United States will share intelligence with Ukraine, etc., etc. A big list of we are one forever and ever and we love each other. And that November 2021 agreement signed between the governments of Ukraine and the United States was the last step, the last drop that Russia could not afford anymore. And that it was the immediate trigger of the invasion. But again, there are many steps. And one more thing that I forgot to say about the last answer that I gave, that Ukraine is an independent sovereign country and have the right to join NATO. Cuba also was an independent sovereign country, and they have the right to place Soviet missiles in their land because it's an independent sovereign country, right? Everybody's an independent sovereign country, and they can do whatever they want on their land. The United States did not believe so, regardless of Cuba being an independent sovereign country. And they were ready to invade Cuba and to blockade Cuba and to go to World War III in 1962 because Cuba, an independent sovereign country, wanted to put missiles in Cuba pointing to the United States. So that independent sovereign country is just up to central limits. If it's a national threat to the United States will not accept that Cuba is an independent sovereign country. If Ukraine joining NATO is a threat to Russia, so then Russia will not accept that Ukraine is an independent sovereign country. Thank you.
Ambassador Kapur, the same question to you.
Sure. I, also would like to mention that the Indian stance in this regard was that the Article 5 of the United Nations Charter states clearly that you have to continue with all your efforts for negotiation and diplomacy. And only if all channels of negotiation and diplomacy fail, then you can move to Article 6, which is to take any action. Now, for months, Russia had been stating very, very clearly that Ukraine should not become a member of NATO. Now, this could have been done unilaterally by Ukraine, by declaring in the parliament that it would not pursue its efforts to become a member of NATO, or NATO could have made a statement that they will not encourage membership of Ukraine into NATO, or the US could have made a statement to that effect. Now, if Russia is saying that this is a red line which cannot be crossed, and then it is putting 100,000 soldiers on the border for so many weeks, I thought those were very, very clear signals. And if you have the leadership of so many countries like France and Germany and UK and others hopping in and out of Moscow and talking to Vladimir Putin and not listening to what he is trying to communicate, and on the contrary, just parroting the US line of Ukraine's right to become a member of NATO. And what Ron has also mentioned currently, which I had alluded to earlier, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, how can you apply different principles on different occasions? How are your geostrategic interests so sacrosanct that missiles cannot be placed next to your borders or near your borders or any countries near you, but you have the full right and authority to go and place missiles in a country next to a country like Russia? So the world cannot be so one-sided. Now, this narrative, as I said earlier, does not go out to the world because the Western narrative dominates the world media. So, I would like to stop here and hand over back to you, Mr. Adityanjee. My own experiences, by the way, I've had a lot of interactions with Jeffrey Pyatt, who was ambassador there in Ukraine, on a personal level when he was posted in India also, and with the Madeleine Albright before she became the Secretary of State. We were both professors at the Georgetown University at that time, and we had very interesting discussions, including on this current topic that we are discussing today. And I was quite surprised by her sort of extreme views on some of these issues, and I did try to challenge them even at that time.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador Kapur. General Jagatbir Singh, do you have any comments on concept of sovereignty of Ukraine to join NATO?
So I think this issue has been covered very well by the previous two panelists. I have very little to offer as far as comments go. It's very rightly brought out. They were moving in that direction, and there were no steps taken by the US to alleviate any fears of the concerns of Russia at that time. And a issue which is not being touched upon, but Ron will be well aware of, after 2014, once the Crimean invasion took place, there's a large US, the NATO and Ukraine was taking place, including certain structural reforms being carried out in their army, including, arming them, training them, and some of these trainers vacated Ukraine just before the war. So, these are things which are known, and like Ambassador Kapur has very rightly said, covered the issue of India's stance, what it says, and I'd just like to give a statement which President Macron of France has just given few days ago, and when this talk is going on, must consider security guarantees for Russia for deployment of weapons that could threaten Russia. So, this is one stance being taken by a very senior leader within NATO, and these security, these were missing, and that is what has led to this conflict. That's what I feel, sir.
I'll go to the next question, and I know a couple of panelists refer to that. What is the impact of all this on international relations and geopolitics in the rest of the world, The question asked is by Ron Jagannathan that initially Putin was seen as a bully, but now it appears that US and NATO combined are the bullies, and world is perceiving like that. And in larger, game, how would China be impacted? How others' perception of China would be impacted, and how this conflict will play out in Indo-Pacific region. What would be the reliability of US word, in Indo-Pacific region vis-a-vis China if US is, invading countries or contributing to war in Europe using NATO. So maybe Ambassador Kapur had commented on some of this, so maybe I'll give him the first chance.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adityanjee. What I'd like to mention here is that the Indian perspective, again, of trying to keep Russia neutral in this, big sort of competition and confrontation between USA on one side and China on the other, with USA being supported by a certain number of countries and China being supported by a certain number of countries. Now, the moment you put Russia into a corner, and Russia is then left with no other alternative but to become closer to China, that joint capacity, Russia is it's the biggest country in the world with tremendous amount of natural resources, phenomenal talent. We have seen it historically in the space aspects, in mathematics, in sciences, in so many areas. Now, a country like that, which has a phenomenal ego also and a very great history. Now, if you are pushing that into China's embrace, suddenly you are making yourself weaker than that combined power of Russia, China, and just a handful of countries who are supporting it, maybe like Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan to some extent, not entirely. On the other hand, USA with all the Western allies and with Australia, Japan, South Korea, etc., is still not in a comfortable position to challenge that grouping. So what happens? India becomes the counterpoise. Now, if India were to weigh in very heavily to the Western side as a partner, then the chances of there being a sort of a way ahead to see how to deal with the situation for the global good would be possible. Now, if on the other hand, you are alienating India also in so many ways, like, upgrading those Pakistani planes, F-16s, which you have provided them earlier, etc., etc., and, creating so many irritants in your relationship and making it even more difficult for India to sort of speak out strongly on your side, and for trying to again try to have a sort of an arrangement or collaboration with India, which is that of an ally or an alliance partner, which India never will get into. India can get into a relationship as a partner, not as an ally. So if you are not going to read those signals which are being stated so clearly, then you are making yourself weaker in the overall global geopolitical and geostrategic structure. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Ambassador Kapur. I will invite Ron Aledo to answer the same question, impact on Indo-Pacific vis-a-vis China and US of this conflict.
The issue with that this affect India and that this affect the way that this affects India and the way this affect China, in my opinion, my humble opinion, is that despite the historic confrontation and the historic animosity between India and China, and for many reasons that we all know, and the Kashmir and the borders, etc., Obviously, that's an issue and confrontation that is still obviously alive today and will not go any way. The thing is that the 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 relationship between India and China and other countries, like part of the BRIC, as we know, South Africa and Brazil. The thing is, they are closer now, including India and China, closer in their international posture because they share a very similar and a very kind of similar position related to this situation between Russia, Crimea, Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and the United States. They have adopted neutrality and a kind of friendly neutrality, actually, that tilts towards Russia. And these have put together their international economic position, specifically when trading oil, when specifically when looking to alternative to the dollar, when looking to alternative to the dominance of the European Union and the United States in economic and geopolitical issues. You need to understand something that very briefly, a German advisor to Helmut Kohl, to the Chancellor Helmut Kohl, he said recently, very recently, a few weeks ago, he said in an interview in the German television, I forgot his name, but he said something very real that we need to understand. He said, when you negotiate with the United States, I know this because I was the advisor, the close advisor for many years of Helmut Kohl in Germany. When you negotiate with the United States and if you agree with the United States will come and give you a big hug. We love you. And they give you a hug so strong that they break your ribs. That's what the German person said. They break your ribs because the hug they give you is so strong because you agree with them. But if you disagree with the United States, they hit you with a whip immediately. And they say, how dare you? You have shame on you for disagreeing with us. And they become your enemies. And the United States try from the very beginning for the whole world to follow them and to follow their posture and to put sanctions on Russia, everybody, and to condemn Russia and to vote against Russia in the United Nations and everybody to follow them. And there were some big countries like China and like India and like Brazil and like small ones like Hungary that say no. And later on, Saudi Arabia and even Israel, they say, no, we're not going to follow your lead on this. We have our independent position. So, and the United States obviously went furious with those countries and extremely serious. They even sent a diplomat of Indian descent. I remember a few months ago to the United States, to India, to try to persuade India to follow our lead. And India stayed firm. No, we're not going to follow you. So basically, what, in my opinion, is that because India and China and many other countries have remained independent in this position towards NATO expansion and to the war now, they have, regardless of their internal confrontation that they still have for borders, obviously, their position in global affairs, their positions in international affairs have been strengthened and have been closer. Brazil, Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned too, South Africa, they have become independent, a third force, a third way, a third wheel in this war confrontation, and they are looking for alternatives to oil, paying the dollar for oil, alternative to the dominance of the euro, alternative to the dominance of the dollar in the world markets, and they are actually creating a third campus or a third way. So I think that that's the way that it have affected more India. India have been standing independent. India have standing strong, and just like the foreign affairs minister of India said, we have about 20% of the world population. We deserve and we have earned the right to have our own position.
Thank you, Ran. We have plenty of more questions, but we have already run out of time. So unfortunately, I will not be able to take any more questions. I will just, sum up the whole thing by saying that every war is an unfortunate event, especially if a war is totally unavoidable. This was a preventable war. People just slow walked into this war over not few days, not few months, over more than a decade. This is the most unfortunate war that we are seeing in 21st century. And it is unfortunate that we are at this predicament. The idea is to avoid the war, not be, supporter of one side or the other side. And that is where the real diplomatic skills lie, that you do not want to drag the world to Third World War, which President of Ukraine has just said that Third World War is going to start. So this was the most unfortunate part. It is leading to food crisis elsewhere. There are food riots in certain countries. I would not name them. And those are all indirect, actually, influences of this ongoing war. I just want to make a facetious comment. And the facetious comment is that comedians like to play to the gallery. If you have real sense of citizenship, don't elect comedians as your leaders. This is what you get when you start, bringing outsiders who do not have any experience in statecraft as the leaders, because you jump into the war. I may be very harsh, but history will judge, and history will dub Vladimir Zelensky as quote unquote the useful idiot of the NATO in this whole conflict. Because what he has achieved is he's got his country destroyed, wrecked, and divided, which was very unfortunate. All was required is to give a guarantee that we will do to Ukraine what was traditionally called Finlandization. If Finlandization of Ukraine was done in 2014, you would not have any war at all. And unfortunately, now Finland sees a future of Ukrainization of Finland because Finland has been Finlandized. That is what we are seeing. So this story probably may not stop at this point in time. I'm highly thankful to our three distinguished panelists who took time off from their busy schedule. And I am also highly thankful to our viewers on a Saturday morning taking more than 1.5 hours for this particular discussion. But we must discuss even, geopolitical situations like this to preserve world peace and to prevent future wars. And we have to learn from these discussions and from the lessons of history to prevent future wars. I'm also highly thankful to Team CSA. I will specifically mention Mr. Rajiv Verma, Mr. Ripudaman Pachori, and Mr. Ankush Bhandari, who have been pillar of my support to organize this kind of events. So with all those thanks, I am officially closing this meeting. Thank you everyone for joining us for this discussion. Namaskar.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.